The dying sun painted the vast prairie in shades of crimson and gold, its fierce light bleeding across the endless expanse of buffalo grass and sagebrush. Dust devils danced in the distance, their spiraling columns reaching toward a sky that seemed to burn with the day's final fury. The air hung thick and dry, carrying the scent of parched earth and the promise of something darker gathering on the horizon. Jake Morgan rode alone, as he had for the past 3 months since leaving Tombstone. His weathered Stetson cast shadows across eyes that had seen too much, gray as gunmetal and twice as cold. The leather of his saddle creaked with each step his horse took, a rhythmic complaint that had become his only companion across the desolate stretches of Arizona territory. His hands, calloused and scarred from years of rope and iron, held the reins with the easy confidence of a man who'd spent more nights under stars than roofs. Behind him lay another town that wanted nothing to do with him. The story was always the same: whispered accusations, sideways glances, mothers pulling their children close when he passed. They called him many things: killer, gun for hire, the devil's own. Some of it was true. Most of it was worse than true. But the one thing he'd never been able to shake was that night in Silver Creek when Tom Garrison died with Jake's bullet in his chest. It didn't matter that Garrison had been reaching for his gun first, or that he'd been fixing to rob the stage with 3 other men. All anyone remembered was Jake Morgan standing over a dead man, smoke still curling from his Colt .45. The wind picked up, carrying with it the taste of alkali and something else, the metallic tang that came before a dust storm. Jake's horse, a sturdy Mustang he'd named Dust for its color and temperament, snorted nervously and tossed its head. Years of survival had taught Jake to trust the animal's instincts. He scanned the horizon, noting the wall of brown rising in the distance like God's own hand reaching down to scrub the earth clean. That's when he heard it, a woman's cry cutting through the building wind. Jake pulled up short, his hand instinctively moving to the worn grip of his pistol. The sound came again, desperate and frightened, from somewhere beyond a cluster of red rocks to his left. He hesitated. Getting involved in other people's troubles had never brought him anything but grief. But something in that voice, maybe the raw edge of fear or the way it seemed to fight against the wind itself, made him turn Dust toward the rocks. What he found there made him forget his own troubles for a moment. A young woman, couldn't have been more than 25, was struggling with a bay mare that had gotten its leg wedged between 2 boulders. The horse's eyes rolled white with panic, and every attempt to pull free only seemed to drive its hoof deeper into the trap. Beside the woman, a boy of maybe 6 or 7 stood clutching a worn cloth doll, his face streaked with tears and dust. The woman's bonnet had fallen back, revealing hair the color of prairie wheat twisted into a practical bun that was coming undone in the wind. Her calico dress, faded from too many washings, was torn at the hem where she'd been kneeling in the dirt. When she looked up and saw Jake, her green eyes went wide with a different kind of fear. "Please," she said, though the word came out more like a gasp. "Please, I don't have much money, but my horse—" "Ma'am," Jake said, dismounting in one fluid motion. He kept his voice low and even, the way he would with a spooked animal. "I'm not here to rob you. Looks like you could use some help." She watched him approach with the wariness of a doe ready to bolt. He'd seen that look before, the way decent folk regarded him when they recognized what he was, or thought they knew what he was. The boy pressed closer to his mother, the doll crushed against his chest. Jake moved past them to examine the trapped horse. The mare was in a bad way. Her legs scraped raw from struggling, but the real danger was the storm bearing down on them. Already the wind was picking up strength, sending small stones skittering across the ground. "Storm's coming fast," he said, pulling off his leather gloves. "We need to get her free now, or we'll all be in trouble." The woman nodded, seeming to grasp the urgency. "I tried to lead her through here. It's a shortcut to town, but she spooked at something and—" "No time for explanations." Jake cut her off, not unkindly. He studied the angle of the horse's leg, the way the rocks pinched together. "I'm going to need you to keep her calm while I work. Can you do that?" She moved to the mare's head without hesitation, murmuring soothing words while stroking the animal's neck. Jake was impressed despite himself. Most women he'd known would have been in hysterics by now, but this one had steel in her spine. He worked quickly, using a piece of driftwood as a lever to pry the rocks apart just enough. The horse fought him, nearly catching him with a wild kick, but he'd handled worse. Behind them, the wall of dust grew larger, blotting out the horizon like a brown curtain being drawn across the world. Almost there, he grunted, putting his shoulder into it. The rock shifted another inch. When I say now, you pull her straight back, hard as you can. The woman wrapped the reins around her hands, bracing herself. The boy had moved closer, wanting to help but too small to do anything but watch with those wide, frightened eyes. Now, they pulled together, the woman with surprising strength, and the mare's leg came free with a wet, scraping sound. The horse stumbled backward, favoring the injured leg but mobile. Jake didn't waste time celebrating. "We need shelter," he said, already moving back to dust. The first fingers of the storm were reaching them, grit stinging exposed skin like tiny needles. "There's an old way station about a mile north. We can make it if we ride hard." The woman looked at her injured horse, clearly torn. The mare could walk, but not fast enough to outrun what was coming. "She can't," she began. "Put the boy on my horse," Jake said, making the decision for all of them. "You ride with him. I'll lead your mare." For a moment, he thought she'd refuse. Her eyes searched his face, looking for something, treachery, maybe, or the cruelty she'd probably been warned about. Whatever she saw there must have satisfied her, because she lifted her son onto Dust's back and swung up behind him with practiced ease. Jake took the bay's reins and mounted behind the woman and boy, one arm around them to hold them steady, the other managing both sets of reins. It was awkward as hell, but it would have to do. Dust, true to his nature, accepted the extra weight without complaint. They rode into the teeth of the storm, the world disappearing behind a veil of flying dirt and debris. Jake pulled his bandana up over his nose and mouth, noticed the woman doing the same with her bonnet, sheltering the boy as best she could. The wind howled like all the demons of hell were chasing them, and maybe they were. Jake had certainly given them enough reason over the years. He almost missed the way station, would have ridden right past if Dust hadn't known the trail better than he did. The small structure materialized out of the brown haze like a ghost, its walls pocked and scarred by years of similar storms. Jake slid down and fought to get the door open against the wind, finally managing to force it wide enough for the horses to enter. Inside was blessed relief from the storm's fury. The abandoned station wasn't much, four walls, a roof that leaked in places, and a stone fireplace that hadn't seen use in years, but it would keep them alive. Jake quickly tended to the horses, getting them settled in what had once been a small stable area, while the woman lit a lantern she'd found on a dusty shelf. In the flickering light, he got his first good look at her. Pretty, but not in the soft, helpless way of town women. This was beauty carved by hard living, strength showing in the set of her jaw and the straightness of her spine. The boy clung to her skirts, stealing glances at Jake when he thought the man wasn't looking. "Thank you," the woman said finally, her voice steady despite everything they'd just been through. "I'm Sarah Whitman. This is my son, Thomas." Jake touched the brim of his hat. "Jake Morgan, ma'am." He saw the recognition flicker across her face. His name had traveled even here. Apparently. Her hand moved unconsciously to draw Thomas closer, and Jake felt the familiar sting of it. But she didn't back away, didn't scream or reach for a weapon. She simply stood there, measuring him with those green eyes that seemed to see too much. "Are you the same Jake Morgan who—" she began, then stopped herself. "Never mind. It doesn't matter. You helped us when you didn't have to. That's all I need to know right now." Outside, the storm raged on, trapping them together in this small space. Jake built a fire with some old wood stacked in the corner, noting how Sarah watched his hands as he worked, not with fear now, but with a curious intensity, as if trying to reconcile the gentle way he coaxed flame from tinder with the violent reputation that preceded him. The boy, Thomas had crept closer to the fire, still clutching his doll, in the light. Jake could see it was meant to be a horse, crudely sewn from scraps but obviously treasured. The sight of it did something funny to his chest, made him remember another child with another toy, long ago and far away, before he'd become what he was now. "Mister?" Thomas's small voice broke through his thoughts. "Is your horse magic?" He wasn't scared of the storm at all. Jake found himself almost smiling. "No magic, boy, just experience. Dust and I have been through a lot of storms together." "My PA had a horse," Thomas said, warming to the subject the way children do. "But he's gone now, the horse and Pa both." "Thomas," Sarah said softly. A warning and an apology wrapped in one word, but Jake just nodded, understanding more than she probably wanted him to. A widow and her son, alone in this harsh country. No wonder she'd been desperate enough to risk the shortcut through those rocks. Every day out here was a gamble between survival and catastrophe. They settled in to wait out the storm, the wind howling around the walls like it was trying to find a way inside. Jake kept his distance, aware of how his presence filled the small space, how Sarah tensed whenever he moved too suddenly, but gradually, as the fire warmed them and the immediate danger passed, some of that wariness began to fade, and in that little pocket of safety, while the world outside tried to tear itself apart, Jake Morgan found himself doing something he hadn't done in years. He began to hope that maybe, just maybe, he'd found something worth staying for. The fire crackled and spit, casting dancing shadows on the weathered walls of the abandoned way station. Outside, the dust storm continued its assault, rattling the loose boards and sending fingers of grit through every crack and crevice. Sarah Whitman sat near the flames, her son Thomas curled against her side, finally succumbing to exhaustion despite the howling wind. Jake Morgan kept to his own corner, hat pulled low, watching the fire more than the woman and child. He'd learned long ago that his presence made folks nervous, and the last thing he wanted was to spook her more than necessary. But in the close confines of the shelter, avoiding each other entirely was impossible. "You're hungry," Sarah said. It wasn't a question. She'd noticed him unconsciously touching his stomach, a habit he thought he'd broken years ago. From her saddlebags, she produced a cloth bundle, hardtack, dried beef, and a few withered apples. "Can't take your food, ma'am," Jake said automatically. "You and the boy need it more. We have enough to share." She divided the meager supplies with practiced efficiency, the movement speaking of someone who'd learned to stretch every resource. "Besides, you saved us from that storm. The least I can do is offer you a meal." They ate in companionable silence, the simple food tasting better than it had any right to. Jake noticed how Sarah gave Thomas the largest apple, how she barely touched her own portion of beef, the kind of sacrifice a parent made without thinking, without expecting recognition. 2 years, she said suddenly, as if continuing a conversation they'd already started. "That's how long we've been alone. My husband Daniel was riding guard on a freight wagon headed to Tucson. Apache raiders hit them just outside of Skeleton Canyon." Her voice remained steady, but her knuckles whitened as she gripped her tin cup. "They brought his body back 3 days later. Thomas was 4. He still asks when Papa's coming home sometimes." Jake stared into the fire, remembering other widows, other children left fatherless by the violence that seemed to follow him like a shadow. "I'm sorry for your loss, ma'am. Are you?" The question held no accusation, only a kind of weary curiosity. Or is that just something people say? He considered the question seriously. "Both, I reckon. Sorry it happened to you. Sorry it happens to anyone. But you're right. The words don't mean much after a while." Sarah studied him across the fire, those green eyes seeing more than he was comfortable with. "You've lost people too. Everyone has, out here." "No," she said softly. "I mean really lost them. The kind of loss that changes who you are, makes you into someone you never thought you'd become." Jake's hand unconsciously moved to his chest, where beneath his shirt lay a scar from a knife that had almost found his heart. The woman who'd wielded it had loved him once, before he'd gotten her brother killed in a range war that nobody won. Maybe so. Thomas stirred in his sleep, mumbling something about horses. Sarah smoothed his hair with infinite tenderness, and Jake found himself looking away from the intimacy of the gesture. Family, home, things he'd given up any right to long ago. "They say you killed a man in Silver Creek," Sarah said. "Shot him down in cold blood. They say a lot of things." "What do you say?" Jake was quiet for a long moment, listening to the storm rage outside. "I say Tom Garrison drew first, and if I hadn't shot him, he'd have robbed that stage and probably killed everyone on it. I say there were 3 other men with him who got away clean because everyone was too busy looking at the one who didn't, and I say it doesn't matter what I say, because folks have already made up their minds. Why were you there? At that particular place? At that particular time?" The question surprised him. Most people didn't care about the why, only the what. "I was hired to guard the stage. Garrison and his boys knew the route, knew there'd be a payroll on board. It was supposed to be easy money for them. But you were in the way. I was doing my job." The words came out harder than he intended. "The stage line hired me because they knew my reputation. They wanted someone who wouldn't hesitate when the time came. Well, I didn't hesitate. And now I'm the villain of the story." Sarah was quiet for a while, absorbing this. "My husband was doing his job too, protecting freight that didn't even belong to him. Sometimes I wonder if any of it's worth it. All this fighting and dying over things that won't matter in 100 years. Your boy will matter," Jake said before he could stop himself. "Keeping him safe, raising him right, that matters." She looked at him sharply. "You sound like you speak from experience." "No, ma'am, just observation." But that wasn't entirely true. There had been a child once, a little girl with dark curls and her mother's smile. She'd be about Thomas's age now, if the fever hadn't taken her, if Jake hadn't been off settling someone else's score when she needed him most. The fire had burned down to embers, and Jake added more wood, careful not to use too much of their limited supply. In the renewed light, he caught Sarah watching him again, but this time there was less wariness in her gaze. "You're not what I expected," she admitted. "What did you expect?" "I don't know. Someone. Harder, meaner. The way people talk about Jake Morgan. I thought you'd be 7 feet tall with hellfire in your eyes." Jake almost smiled at that. "Sorry to disappoint." "I didn't say I was disappointed." She paused, seeming to weigh her words. "You could have ridden on when you heard me calling for help. Most men would have, with a storm coming. Why didn't you?" He didn't have a good answer for that. The truth was, he'd been asking himself the same question. "Maybe I'm tired of riding on." The wind chose that moment to slam something heavy against the door, making them all jump. Thomas woke with a cry, and Sarah immediately pulled him closer, murmuring comfort. Jake checked the door's barricade, making sure it would hold. "Is the storm monster coming to get us?" Thomas asked, his small voice tight with fear. "No monsters here, boy," Jake said, surprising himself with how gentle his voice came out. "Just wind and dirt having a temper tantrum. It'll blow itself out soon enough. Like when I get mad and kick things? Something like that." Thomas considered this, then looked up at Jake with the direct gaze children had before the world taught them to look away. "Mama says I shouldn't kick things when I'm mad. Does that mean the wind is being naughty?" Despite everything, Jake felt his mouth twitch toward a smile. "I reckon it does. Then it should go sit in the corner until it's sorry." This time Jake did smile, just a little. If only it were that easy. Sarah watched this exchange with something unreadable in her expression. When Thomas settled back against her, she said quietly, "He hasn't talked to a man since Daniel died. Most of the men in town either ignore us or—" She trailed off, but Jake could fill in the blanks. A pretty young widow with a child and no protection was vulnerable in ways that attracted the wrong kind of attention. "Is that why you were taking shortcuts? To avoid town?" She nodded. "I have a small place about 5 miles north of Gila Bend. It's not much, but it's ours. I only go to town when I absolutely have to. Supplies, selling eggs, that sort of thing. Today I was trying to get back before the storm hit. A bitter smile crossed her face. So much for that plan. You've been managing alone for 2 years. Managing might be too generous a word. Surviving, more like, Daniel left us the land and a few cattle, but it's hard. Everything out here is hard. She looked down at Thomas. But it's better than the alternatives. My sister in St. Louis offered to take us in, but that would mean giving up the land. It's all Thomas has left of his father. Jake understood that kind of stubborn pride. The need to hold on to something even when letting go might be easier. He'd carried his own burdens for so long they'd become part of him, inseparable from whoever he might have been without them. The night wore on, the storm gradually losing its fury. They talked in fits and starts, sharing the kind of truths that darkness and danger sometimes pulled out of people. Sarah told him about meeting Daniel at a church social in Missouri, how he'd convinced her to come west with promises of adventure and prosperity. Jake found himself telling her about his early days as a cowhand, before violence became his trade, when he still believed in simple things like right and wrong. "Do you regret it?" Sarah asked. "The path you took?" "Every day," Jake admitted. "But regret doesn't change anything. You make choices, and then those choices make you, after a while, there's no going back to who you were before." "I don't believe that," Sarah said firmly. "People can change. They can choose to be different. Maybe some people can. Maybe you're one of them." The words hung in the air between them, fragile as butterfly wings. Jake didn't know how to respond to that kind of hope, so he didn't try. Instead, he banked the fire and suggested they try to get some sleep. The worst of the storm had passed, and come morning they'd need to move on. Sarah settled Thomas on a makeshift bed of saddle blankets, then surprised Jake by spreading her own blanket closer to where he sat. Not too close. She was still a respectable woman, after all, but close enough that he could hear her breathing, could smell the faint scent of lavender water that somehow survived beneath the dust and sweat. "Jake?" she said softly, after he thought she'd fallen asleep. "Ma'am, thank you for stopping, for helping us, for being kind to Thomas. He needs that. Needs to know there are still good men in the world." Jake stared up at the leak-stained ceiling, throat suddenly tight. "I'm not a good man, Mrs. Whitman." "Maybe not," she agreed. "But you're not the monster they make you out to be either." As sleep finally claimed him, Jake found himself thinking that might be the kindest thing anyone had said to him in years, and somehow that kindness hurt worse than all the condemnation he'd faced, because it made him remember what it felt like to be worth saving. Dawn came slowly to the desert, painting the sky in shades of rose and gold that seemed almost gentle after the violence of the night's storm. Jake woke to find Thomas standing by the door, peering out through a crack at the transformed landscape. "Mr. Jake," the boy whispered, clearly trying not to wake his mother. "Everything looks different." Jake rose stiffly, joints protesting after a night on the hard floor, and joined the boy at the door. The storm had indeed changed things. Familiar landmarks were obscured by new dunes, and the trail they'd followed was completely erased. But the air was clear now, washed clean, and the morning sun promised heat without the suffocating dust. "Storms do that," Jake said. "They tear everything up, make you find new paths." "Is that bad?" Jake glanced back at Sarah, still sleeping, her face peaceful in the early light. "Sometimes the new path is better than the old one." They ventured outside to check on the horses. Sarah's mare was favoring her injured leg, but seemed sound enough to travel slowly. Jake examined the wound, cleaning it with water from his canteen and tearing a strip from his spare shirt to bandage it. "You're good with horses," Thomas observed, watching Jake's gentle ministrations. "Had plenty of practice. Out here, a man who can't tend his horse doesn't last long. Will you teach me? Mama tries, but she says I need to learn from someone who really knows." The request caught Jake off guard. He'd been many things. Hired gun, drifter, killer, but never a teacher. I won't be around long enough for lessons. Boy. Thomas's face fell, and Jake felt like he'd kicked a puppy before he could figure out how to soften the blow. Sarah emerged from the station, hair hastily pinned up, dress brushed as clean as circumstances allowed. "Good morning," she said, her voice carefully neutral. Jake wondered how much she'd heard. They broke their fast with the last of the food, then prepared to move on. The question of their destination hung unspoken in the air until Jake finally addressed it. "Your place is north, town's east. My road takes me south." He busied himself with Dust's saddle, not looking at either of them. "I can see you safe to the main trail. After that, you disappear again," Sarah finished, like smoke on the wind. Something in her tone made him look up. She wasn't angry or disappointed, at least not openly. But there was a sadness in her eyes that seemed older than her years. "It's better that way," Jake said, "for everyone." Sarah didn't argue, just helped Thomas onto her mare's back before climbing up behind him. They rode in silence through the morning heat, Jake leading the way through the altered landscape. He found himself acutely aware of every sound, the creak of leather, the horses breathing, the soft murmur of Sarah pointing out landmarks to Thomas. They were perhaps 2 miles from the main trail when Jake spotted the danger. Fresh horse tracks, maybe half a dozen riders, cutting across their path from the east. The tracks were deep, the horses running hard. Jake's instincts, honed by years of staying alive, screamed warning. "What is it?" Sarah asked, noticing his sudden tension. "Riders, moving fast." He studied the tracks more carefully. Shod horses, so not Apache, but riding like the devil's behind them. Or like they're chasing something. Sarah's face paled. "The Garrison gang, Tom's brothers. They've been hitting stages and homesteads all along the territory line." Jake's hand moved to his gun. Of course. It would be the Garrisons. As if killing Tom hadn't made him enough enemies. Now he might face the rest of the family with a woman and child to protect. "We need to move," he said. "Now." But it was already too late. Dust figures appeared on a ridge to their east, spreading out in a pattern Jake recognized all too well. They'd been seen. "Can we outrun them?" Sarah asked, though her tone suggested she already knew the answer. "Not with your mare lame." Jake's mind raced through options, finding precious few. The landscape offered little cover, scattered rocks, a dry wash that might hide them temporarily. Nothing that would stop determined men. "There," he said, pointing to a cluster of boulders about a 1/4 mile north. "Best cover we're going to find." They rode hard. Sarah clutching Thomas tight, her injured mare gamely struggling to keep pace. Behind them, Jake could hear the pursuit beginning, whoops and hollers that sent ice down his spine. The Garrisons had recognized him. This wouldn't be a robbery. This would be a reckoning. They made the rocks with moments to spare. Jake practically pulled Sarah and Thomas from the saddle, pushing them behind the largest boulder before turning to face what was coming. 6 riders, just as he'd guessed. The 2 in front were clearly Tom's brothers. Same hawkish features, same mean eyes. Jake Morgan, the elder, who Jake remembered was called Zeke, reined up just out of easy pistol range. "Been looking for you. Murderer." "Your brother drew first." "Garrison," Jake called back. "There were witnesses. Bought witnesses." The younger brother, Cal, spat. "You shot Tom in cold blood for that stage line gold." Jake could feel Sarah and Thomas pressing against the rocks behind him. This was exactly why he traveled alone, why he kept moving. His past had a way of catching up at the worst possible moments. "Let the woman and boy go," Jake said. "This is between us." Zeke's laugh was ugly. "Everything you touch is between us. Morgan, every soul you corrupt with your presence. That pretty widow there, she know what you really are? She know about Mary Thompson? About what happened in Yuma?" Jake's jaw tightened. Mary. Another ghost. Another failure. Another reason he didn't deserve the kind of hope Sarah's eyes had offered him last night. "I know enough." Sarah's voice rang out, surprising everyone. She stepped partially into view, chin raised despite her obvious fear. "I know he helped us when he didn't have to." I know he's shown more kindness to my son in one night than you men probably have in your whole lives." "Ma'am," Cal drawled, "you're either too trusting or too foolish. Either way, step aside. This ain't your fight." "You made it my fight when you threatened us." Jake moved slightly, putting himself more firmly between the Garrisons and Sarah. "Right on," he said quietly. "This doesn't have to end in blood." "It ended in blood when you killed our brother." Zeke snarled. He drew his gun in one smooth motion, and everything happened at once. Jake's Colt cleared leather with the speed that had made his reputation. His first shot took Zeke in the shoulder, spinning him from his saddle. Cal fired wild, the bullet sparking off stone inches from Jake's head. The other 4 riders scattered, seeking their own cover. "Stay down!" Jake shouted to Sarah and Thomas, then rolled to a new position as bullets filled the air where he'd been standing. The fight was brief but vicious. Jake had position and experience, but the Garrisons had numbers. He dropped another rider who tried to flank them, sent Cal diving for cover with a shot that took his hat off. But ammunition was limited, and they all knew it. Then Thomas screamed. Jake spun to see one of the gang had circled wide. Coming up behind their position, the man had Sarah by the hair, dragging her away from the rocks while she fought like a wildcat. Thomas was clinging to her skirts, tiny fists pummeling the attacker's legs. Jake didn't think, he just moved, crossing the space in 3 strides. His gun hand swept up and around, the heavy Colt crushing into the man's temple. The outlaw dropped like a stone, and Jake caught Sarah as she stumbled free. "You hurt!" She shook her head, eyes wide but determined. Then her expression changed to horror, looking past him. "Jake!" He turned, knowing he was too late, seeing Cal's gun aimed at his chest. Time slowed to honey. He could see the cylinder starting to rotate, see Cal's finger tightening on the trigger. Sarah screamed something. Thomas was crying. The shot was impossibly loud, but it wasn't Cal's gun. The youngest Garrison brother looked down in surprise at the spreading red stain on his shirt, then toppled backward. Behind him, Zeke lowered his smoking pistol, his wounded shoulder painting his own shirt crimson. "Enough," Zeke said heavily. "Tom's dead. Now Cal's dead. Enough." Jake kept his gun trained on the older brother, not trusting this sudden peace. "Your call, Garrison." Zeke looked at him for a long moment, then at Sarah and Thomas huddled together. Something shifted in his expression. Not forgiveness, never that, but maybe understanding. "Tom always was too quick to draw," he admitted. "And Cal would have shot through the woman to get to you. That ain't what we were raised to be." He gestured to the 2 remaining riders. "We're leaving, but if I see you again, Morgan—" "You won't," Jake said simply. They watched the Garrisons collect their dead and wounded, watched them ride away until they were just dust specks on the horizon. Only then did Jake lower his gun, suddenly aware that his hands were shaking. "You saved us," Sarah said softly. "Again, you saved me," Jake countered, remembering her stepping up, speaking out when she could have stayed hidden. That was a damn fool thing to do. "Language," she said automatically, glancing at Thomas. Then, softer, "I couldn't let them hurt you, not after—" She didn't finish, but she didn't need to. Something had shifted between them in the night, in the quiet honesty of their conversation. Something that made her risk her life for his, made him forget his own safety when she was threatened. Thomas tugged on Jake's coat. "Are the bad men gone?" "Yeah, boy, they're gone." "Are you going too?" The question hung in the air like morning mist. Jake looked down at the child's earnest face, then at Sarah. She wasn't asking him to stay. She had too much pride for that, but her eyes held a question, a possibility. "The main trail's just over that rise," he said finally. "I should see you safely there, at least." It wasn't an answer. Not really. But it wasn't goodbye either. As they gathered the horses and continued their journey, Jake found himself thinking about new paths, about storms that tore up the old trails and forced you to find different ways forward. Maybe, just maybe, This was one of those times. The sun climbed higher, baking the moisture from the earth, and they rode on through a landscape made new by wind and violence. Behind them lay the evidence of Jake's old life, blood on sand, the endless cycle of retribution. Ahead lay uncertainty, but also something else, something that might, if he was very careful and very lucky, be called hope. Sarah began humming softly, a hymn Jake half remembered from childhood. Thomas joined in, his young voice sweet and slightly off-key. And Jake Morgan, killer and outcast, found himself oddly content to simply ride alongside them, letting their music wash over him like baptism, like forgiveness, like the promise of home. The town of Gila Bend squatted on the desert floor like a collection of sun-bleached bones, its wooden buildings weathered to the color of dust and disappointment. As they rode down the main street, Jake could feel the change in atmosphere like a physical weight settling on his shoulders. Conversations died mid-sentence. Men stepped out of doorways to stare. Women pulled their children closer, whispering behind raised hands. "Jake Morgan," someone muttered, and the name rippled through the street like a stone thrown in still water. Sarah's spine straightened beside him, her chin lifting in that way he'd come to recognize as her preparing for battle. Thomas, less aware of the undercurrents, waved at a group of children who were quickly hustled away by their mothers. "The mercantile's just ahead," Sarah said, her voice carefully neutral. "I need supplies before we head to the homestead." Jake knew he should leave now. Every instinct screamed at him to touch his hat, wish her well, and ride out before his presence brought her more trouble. But something in the way her jaw was set, the white-knuckled grip she had on the reins, made him dismount alongside her. "I'll wait with the horses," he said. "No." The word came out sharp, almost defiant. "You'll come inside. I won't have people saying I'm ashamed to be seen with the man who saved my son's life." Before Jake could protest, she'd swept into Morrison's mercantile with Thomas in tow, leaving him no choice but to follow. The bell above the door jangled like an alarm, and Henry Morrison looked up from his ledger with a merchant smile that died when he saw Jake. "Mrs. Whitman," Morrison said, his eyes never leaving Jake's face. "I heard you got caught in that storm yesterday. Glad to see you made it through all right." "Thanks to Mr. Morgan," Sarah said crisply, moving to examine the bolts of cloth on display. "We'd have been buried in dust if not for him." Morrison's expression soured further. His wife, Emma, emerged from the back room, took one look at Jake, and gasped as if he'd pulled a gun on her. "Sarah Whitman," Emma hissed. "What are you thinking? Bringing that man in here? I'm thinking I need 5 pounds of flour, 2 of sugar, coffee, and some of that medicine for horse wounds." Sarah replied evenly. "Can you help me with that, or should I take my business to Carson's?" The threat of lost commerce warred with moral indignation on Emma Morrison's pinched face. Commerce won, as it usually did. But she made sure to slam each item on the counter with unnecessary force. Jake stood by the door, trying to make himself smaller, less threatening. It was a futile effort. He caught a glimpse of himself in the mirror behind the counter trail-worn clothes, gun worn low, face weathered by sun and violence. He looked exactly like what he was, a dangerous man in a place that wanted no danger. "That'll be $3.40, Morrison said, his tone suggesting he'd rather be handling rattlesnakes than taking Sarah's money. Sarah reached for her purse, and Jake saw her shoulders tense. She counted the coins twice, came up short, counted again. The Morrisons exchanged knowing looks. I can bring the rest next week," Sarah said, her pride clearly warring with necessity. "After I sell some eggs in cash on the barrel, Mrs. Whitman." Morrison interrupted. "You know the rules. Times are hard for everyone." Jake moved before he'd consciously decided to, laying $4 silver on the counter. "For the lady's purchases," he said quietly, "and whatever candy the boy wants." The store went silent except for Thomas's delighted gasp. Sarah turned to stare at Jake, color rising in her cheeks. "I can't—" "You can pay me back when you're able," Jake said, meeting her eyes steadily. "No hurry." Morrison scooped up the coins as if they might bite him. "Blood money," his wife muttered, not quite under her breath. "Earned from killing and worse. Every dollar in this store came from someone's sweat or sorrow." Jake replied mildly. "At least mine's honest about it." Emma Morrison's face went red as a beet, but before she could retort, the bell jangled again. Sheriff Wallace filled the doorway, his badge catching the afternoon light. He was a big man running to fat, with the shrewd eyes of someone who'd learned to navigate between law and expedience. "Heard you were in town, Morgan," Wallace said, hand resting on his gun butt with practiced casualness. "Also heard there was some shooting out by Skeleton Ridge this morning. Garrison boys are carrying 2 bodies back to their ranch." "They drew first," Jake said simply. "Ask Mrs. Whitman. She saw the whole thing." Wallace's gaze shifted to Sarah. "That true, ma'am?" "They threatened us," Sarah confirmed. "Mr. Morgan defended us. If not for him, Thomas and I would likely be dead." Wallace chewed this over. "Still, might be best if you moved along. Morgan, this town's got enough troubles without old feuds playing out on Main Street. He'll leave when he's ready," Sarah said, and the steel in her voice surprised everyone, including Jake. "Or are you suggesting the law in Gila Bend only protects certain people?" Wallace's face darkened. "Now, Mrs. Whitman, my husband died protecting cargo for this town's merchants," Sarah continued, her voice rising. "Where was the law then? Where was the concern for keeping trouble away?" She grabbed her purchases with shaking hands. "Mr. Morgan has shown more honor in 2 days than this whole town has in 2 years. If that makes you uncomfortable, perhaps you should examine why." She stormed out, Thomas hurrying to keep up, leaving Jake to follow in her wake. Behind them, he could hear the explosion of gossip beginning. By nightfall, everyone in 50 miles would know that the widow Whitman had taken up with the notorious Jake Morgan. Outside, Sarah was already loading her purchases into her saddlebags, movements sharp with anger. "Hypocrites," she muttered. "Every last one of them. They'll buy from smugglers, hire guns when it suits them, but heaven forbid someone admits to being what they all are underneath." "You shouldn't have done that," Jake said quietly. "Made enemies for my sake." She whirled on him. "They were already my enemies. They just hid it better before." Her anger suddenly deflated, leaving her looking young and tired. "When Daniel died, not one of them offered to help bring in our crop. Not one offered to check on us through the winter. But they were happy to buy my eggs cheap and suggest I might find life easier if I was more accommodating to certain gentlemen in town." Jake's hands curled into fists. "Who?" "It doesn't matter. I handled it." She touched Thomas's shoulder as the boy pressed against her side. "We've managed alone. We'll keep managing. The Garrisons won't let this morning go." Jake warned. "They said they were done, but grief has a way of changing minds, and now the whole town knows you defended me. That makes you a target." Sarah lifted her chin in that stubborn way he was coming to recognize. "Then I suppose you'll have to stay until we know for certain. Won't you?" The words hung between them, part challenge, part invitation. Jake knew he should refuse. Every moment he stayed increased the danger to her and Thomas. But looking at them, this brave, stubborn woman and her trusting son, he found his usual arguments crumbling. "Your place got a barn?" he asked finally. Hope flickered in Sarah's eyes. "A small one. The roof leaks, but it's shelter. Then I suppose I could stay on for a day or two, just to make sure the Garrisons don't come calling." Thomas let out a whoop of joy, dancing around like his namesake horse doll had come to life. Sarah's smile was more restrained, but Jake caught the relief in it. The loneliness eased just a little. They left town with the sun hanging low, painting their shadows long across the dusty street. Jake could feel eyes on them from every window, could practically hear the tongues wagging. By tomorrow, Sarah's reputation would be in tatters, her association with him the final proof of whatever moral failing the town gossips had been attributing to her. "I'm sorry," he said as they cleared the last buildings. For what this will cost you." Sarah glanced at him, then away. "You know what's strange? I thought I'd care more. I thought their opinion mattered. But when I saw them looking at you like you were dirt beneath their boots, when I remembered how they'd looked at me the same way..." She shrugged. "Maybe some things matter more than reputation." "Like what?" She was quiet for a moment, watching Thomas ride slightly ahead, practicing the posture Jake had shown him. "Like kindness, like courage, like having someone willing to stand between your child and danger, regardless of the cost." Jake had no answer for that. He'd been called many things in his life: fast gun, killer, the devil's own hand, but kind wasn't usually among them. Yet here was this woman, seeing something in him he'd thought was long dead, if it had ever existed at all. They rode through the cooling evening, the desert painting itself in purples and golds. Tomorrow would bring new challenges. The garrisons might regroup. The town might decide Sarah had crossed some invisible line. His own past might catch up in ways he couldn't predict. But for now, there was just this: a woman, a child, and a man who'd forgotten what it felt like to be needed for something other than violence. It wasn't redemption. Jake was too honest with himself to believe in that. But it was, perhaps, a start. As they turned onto the narrow track that led to Sarah's homestead, Thomas called back, "Mr. Jake, look, I'm riding just like you showed me." And Jake Morgan, outcast and gunfighter, found himself smiling. A real smile. Not the cold thing he showed before violence, for the first time in longer than he could remember. "That's good, boy," he called back. "Real good." Beside him, Sarah hummed at him again, and Jake let himself imagine, just for a moment, that he could be the kind of man who deserved this fragile, tentative trust. The kind who could protect without destroying, who could stay without bringing doom in his wake. The desert didn't care about a man's wishes, and neither did his past. But for now, in this golden moment between day and night, Jake let himself hope. The Crawford gang rode in like a plague 3 days later. Just as Jake was teaching Thomas how to mend a fence, he saw the dust cloud first, that telltale sign of riders coming fast and hard. Without a word, he scooped Thomas up and carried him to the house, his movements calm but urgent. "Sarah," he called, and something in his tone brought her running from the garden. "Riders coming. 6, maybe 7. Take Thomas and get to the root cellar." Her face paled, but she didn't waste time with questions. That was one of the things Jake had come to appreciate about her in the days since he'd decided to stay. She understood when talking could get you killed. "What about you?" she asked, already pulling Thomas toward the back of the house. "I'll handle it." He checked his Colt, then the Winchester he'd been using to hunt rabbits. "Whatever you hear, don't come out until I say it's clear." Sarah hesitated at the cellar door, her eyes meeting his in them. He saw fear, but not for herself. "Jake, go," he said gently. "Now." She disappeared into the cellar with Thomas, and Jake heard the heavy bar drop into place. Good. Whatever happened next, they'd be safe. He positioned himself on the porch, rifle across his knees, and waited. The riders thundered into the yard in a cloud of dust and arrogance. Jake recognized their type immediately. Border trash who discovered it was easier to take than earn. The leader, a scarred man with dead eyes, dismounted with theatrical slowness. "Well, well," the man drawled. "Jake Morgan, heard you'd gone soft, playing house with some widow woman. Buck Crawford." Jake acknowledged. He'd heard of Crawford. Nothing good. "You're a long way from Texas. Territory's more profitable these days. Less rangers, more opportunities." Crawford's gaze swept the modest homestead. "Speaking of opportunities, I hear this land sits on the new rail route, worth a pretty penny to the right buyer." So that was it. Jake had wondered why anyone would bother with Sarah's hardscrabble farm. "Land's not for sale." "Everything's for sale. Morgan. Just a matter of price." Crawford smiled, showing too many teeth. "The widow can take our offer and leave vertical, Or refuse and leave horizontal. Either way, she leaves. Jake stood slowly, the rifle shifting in his grip. Third option. You leave. Now. While you still can. Crawford laughed, and his men joined in. 7 of us. 1 of you. Even Jake Morgan can't beat those odds. Want to bet your life on it? The laughter died. Jake had learned long ago that reputation could be a weapon as sharp as any blade. These men knew his name, knew what it meant. The question was whether their greed outweighed their fear. Here's what I know, Crawford said, his hand hovering near his gun. You've been out of the game too long. Playing nursemaid has made you soft, and that widow must be something special to keep Jake Morgan on a leash. Jake's expression never changed, but inside, cold rage began to build. Not at the insult to him, he'd heard worse, but at the implied threat to Sarah. Last warning, Crawford. Or what? You'll kill us all. Then what happens to your widow and her brat when the law comes? When our friends come? Crawford shook his head. No, you're trapped. Morgan, by your own conscience. Who'd have thought the famous Jake Morgan would be brought low by a woman's skirts? It was a good point, and Jake knew it. In the old days, he'd have started shooting and sorted out the consequences later. But now there were consequences he cared about. People who mattered more than his own survival. Tell you what, Crawford continued, sensing Jake's hesitation. We'll give the widow a week to think it over. Generous terms. $500 for land worth 10 times that to the railroad. She can start fresh somewhere else. Find another man to protect her. Maybe one who doesn't bring death wherever he goes. Jake heard the cellar door creak behind him. I told you to stay, he began, turning slightly. Crawford went for his gun, even distracted, even older and supposedly softer. Jake Morgan was still Jake Morgan. His rifle swung up and fired in one smooth motion, the bullet catching Crawford in the chest before the man's pistol cleared leather. Jake dove sideways as the other men opened fire, splinters exploding from the porch post where he'd been standing. He rolled behind the water trough, rifle tracking to the next target. Years of muscle memory took over. Sight, breathe, squeeze. Another rider tumbled from his saddle. The others scattered, seeking cover, firing wildly. Jake heard glass shatter. Sarah's window. Cold fury turned to hot rage. He broke cover, Colt in hand now, and advanced on the nearest gunman. The man saw him coming, saw death walking toward him in worn boots and trail clothes. His shot went wide, panic spoiling his aim. Jake's didn't... Morgan! One of Crawford's men had circled to the barn, had a clear shot at Jake's back. Jake spun, knowing he was too late, knowing this was how it would end. The sharp crack of a rifle from the house. The gunman jerked, clutched his shoulder, and fell. Jake glanced back to see Sarah in the doorway, his Winchester smoking in her hands. The remaining 3 men had seen enough. They broke for their horses. Spurring hard for the horizon, Jake let them go. Dead men told no tales, but living men spread fear. By nightfall, every outlaw in the territory would know that Jake Morgan still had his edge, and that he wasn't alone. Crawford was still alive, breathing in wet, ragged gasps. Jake stood over him, reloading with practiced ease. Should have stayed in Texas, Jake said quietly. Railroad. Won't stop. Crawford gasped. Others will come. Maybe. But you won't be around to see it. Crawford's eyes widened, then went empty. Jake turned away to find Sarah still standing in the doorway, rifle trembling in her hands. Her face was pale, but her eyes were steady. I told you to stay in the cellar, he said, and let them shoot you in the back. She lowered the rifle carefully. I may not be a gunfighter, Mr. Morgan, but I can point and pull a trigger when needed. Thomas appeared beside her, eyes wide as saucers. Mama shot a bad man. To protect Jake, Sarah said firmly. To protect all of us. Sometimes that's what we have to do. Jake felt something shift inside his chest. In all his years of violence, no one had ever stood with him. He'd always faced his enemies alone, expected to die alone. But this woman, this stubborn, brave, impossible woman, had risked everything to watch his back. "Thank you," he said. The words inadequate, but all he had. Sarah's smile was shaky but real. "Partners watch out for each other, don't they?" Partners. The word hung in the air between them, carrying weight Jake wasn't sure either of them was ready to acknowledge. But there was no time for that now. They had bodies to deal with, and plans to make. "The railroad," Sarah said as they worked to load the dead onto their horses. "Crawford mentioned the railroad." Jake nodded. "Explains why they want your land. If the rail comes through here, then this worthless patch of dirt becomes valuable." She paused in her work, understanding dawning. That's why the bank's been pressing about Daniel's loan. That's why men like Crawford are suddenly interested. "It's going to get worse before it gets better," Jake warned. "Crawford was right about one thing. Others will come." Sarah straightened, and there was that chin lift he'd come to know so well. "Then we'd better be ready for them." "We? Unless you're planning to leave?" The question tried to sound casual but failed. Thomas had gone very still, watching Jake with those two serious eyes. Jake looked at them. This woman who'd chosen to stand beside him. This boy who'd started calling him Sir with shy respect, and realized the decision had already been made. Maybe it had been made that night in the storm, or when Sarah defended him in town, or when she'd saved his life moments ago. "No," he said simply. "I'm not leaving." Thomas whooped and threw himself at Jake, small arms wrapping around his legs. Jake stood frozen, uncertain how to respond to this display of affection. It had been so long since anyone had been glad for his presence rather than feared it. Sarah's hand touched his arm lightly. "We should send word to the sheriff. Make this official." Jake doubted Sheriff Wallace would see their side of things, but he nodded. They'd do this properly, legally, for Thomas's sake, if nothing else. As they prepared to ride to town with the bodies, Jake caught Sarah's arm. "You understand what this means? Standing with me? The whole territory will know now. My enemies become your enemies, and your friends," she asked. "Do they become mine too?" Jake's mouth quirked in what might have been a smile. "Don't have many of those." "You have 2 now," Sarah said firmly. 3, if you count the horse. That night, after the sheriff's questions and the town's stares, after Thomas was asleep and the house secured, Jake sat on the porch cleaning his guns. Sarah joined him, bringing coffee and companionable silence. "I've been thinking," she said eventually, "about the railroad, if it's really coming through. We need to be smart, file proper claims, maybe take on more cattle, make improvements the railroad would want to keep." "Planning for the future," Jake observed. "That's new for me." "You've been living day to day for too long," Sarah said gently. "Maybe it's time to try living for tomorrow too." Jake considered this as he worked oil into the Colt's mechanism. Living for tomorrow meant believing you'd have one. It meant hope and plans, and all the things he'd given up the right to years ago. "I don't know if I can," he admitted. "Be what you need. What Thomas needs. I know guns and violence. Not sure I know much else anymore." Sarah was quiet for a moment. Then, "Thomas needs someone to teach him to be strong but gentle, to be brave but not reckless, to protect what matters without losing himself to the violence." She looked at him directly. "Seems to me you're learning those very things yourself." The moon rose full and bright, washing the desert in silver. Somewhere in the distance, a coyote called to its pack. Jake heard Sarah's breathing beside him, steady and trusting, and felt something he'd thought long dead stir in his chest. Not love. He wasn't ready to name it that, but possibility. "All right," he said finally. "We'll try it your way. Plan for tomorrow." Sarah smiled, and it transformed her face, made her look young and hopeful despite the hard years. "That's all I ask, that we try." As if in agreement, the night wind carried the distant whistle of a train, still far off but coming closer. Change was coming to this harsh land, to their small homestead, to the three souls who'd found each other against all odds. Jake didn't know if he was ready for it, but for the first time in longer than he could remember, he was willing to stay and find out. The attack came at midnight, swift and brutal as a desert storm. Jake woke to the acrid smell of smoke and the orange glow of fire dancing on his barn wall. He rolled from his bedroll, gun already in hand, and peered through a crack in the barn door. The chicken coop was ablaze, flames reaching hungrily toward the main house. "Sarah!" He burst from the barn at a dead run, only to dive sideways as gunfire erupted from the shadows. Bullets whined past his ear, kicking up dust where he'd been standing. He rolled behind the water pump, mind racing. How many? Where were they positioned? Were Sarah and Thomas safe? A woman's scream split the night. Not Sarah. Someone else. Jake risked a look and saw figures dragging someone from the house. In the firelight, he caught a glimpse of Sarah's face, fierce and fighting, before a man backhanded her to the ground. Cold rage filled him, the kind that made his hands steady and his mind clear. He counted muzzle flashes. 4, maybe 5 shooters. They had cover behind the overturned wagon and the tool shed. Professional positioning. This wasn't random violence. This was planned. "Morgan!" a voice called from the darkness. "Come out and face justice like a man." Jake didn't recognize the voice, but he recognized the type. Another bounty hunter, maybe, or relatives of men he'd killed. It didn't matter. What mattered was Sarah and Thomas. He heard Thomas cry out from inside the house, and something primitive stirred in Jake's chest, moving low and fast. He circled toward the back of the property, using shadows and terrain he'd memorized in his days here. The shooters were focused on the barn and front approach. Classic mistake. The first man never saw him coming. Jake's knife was silent, efficient. The second managed half a shout before Jake's gun butt dropped him. Now he had their flank, and better. He had their attention divided. "He's behind us," someone yelled. Jake fired twice, watched a shadow stumble and fall. Return fire splintered the fence post beside him, but he was already moving. Years of experience guided him. Never stay still. Make them react to you. Control the battlefield. "Let the woman and boy go," Jake called out, circling again. "This is between us. You took my brother in Amarillo," the voice snarled back. "Shot him down like a dog. Amarillo." Jake remembered. A card cheat who'd pulled a hideout gun when caught. Self-defense, clear as day. But family rarely saw it that way. "Your brother was a cheat and a back shooter," Jake replied, firing at a muzzle flash. "He got what he earned." More gunfire, wild and angry now. Jake heard glass breaking. Sarah's voice raised in defiance. He needed to get to the house, but the open ground between him and the door was a killing field. Then inspiration struck. The burning chicken coop was spreading to the fence line. Jake shot the support posts, and burning timber crashed down, creating a curtain of flame and smoke. Using it for cover, he sprinted for the house. A figure loomed in the doorway, one of the attackers, dragging Thomas by the collar. The boy was fighting, kicking, and biting like a wildcat. Jake didn't hesitate. His shot took the man high in the shoulder, spinning him away from Thomas. "Get inside." Jake shoved the boy through the door, following close behind. The house was chaos. Furniture overturned. Sarah backed into a corner with a kitchen knife, facing 2 men who seemed to be enjoying her fear. They turned at Jake's entrance, but he was already moving. The Colt roared twice, and both men went down. "Jake!" Sarah's warning came almost too late. He spun, firing instinctively as another attacker burst through the back door. The man's shot went wide. Jake's didn't. Sudden silence fell, broken only by the crackling of flames outside and their own harsh breathing. Jake quickly reloaded, ears straining for any sound of more attackers. "Is it over?" Thomas whispered from behind the overturned table where Sarah had pushed him. "Not yet," Jake said grimly. "There's at least one more out there. The talker." As if summoned, the voice called again. "You killed them all. Morgan, my whole gang. But I've still got one card to play." Jake's blood chilled as he realized what that meant. He rushed to the window, saw a figure on horseback near the well. The man held a torch in one hand and a bundle of dynamite in the other. "Maybe I can't kill you," the man shouted, "but I can blow this whole place to hell. You want to die protecting strangers? Morgan, so be it." Time slowed. Jake saw the man's arm draw back to throw, saw the trajectory that would land the dynamite against the house, saw Sarah and Thomas behind him, trusting him to keep them safe. He didn't remember making the decision to move. One moment he was at the window, the next he was through the door, rifle rising to his shoulder. The throw or the shot. It would be close, too close. The rifle cracked, the torch spun from the man's hand, the dynamite tumbling separately, fuse still burning. Jake was already running, scooping up the explosive, yanking the fuse free with seconds to spare. The attacker slumped in his saddle, Jake's bullet having found its mark. His horse, spooked by the gunfire and flames, bolted into the darkness with its dead rider still mounted. Jake stood in the yard, dynamite in hand, suddenly aware of how close they'd all come to dying. His hands shook now, the reaction setting in. Behind him, he heard Sarah emerge from the house. "Jake?" Her voice was soft, concerned. "Are you hurt?" He turned to face her, saw Thomas peering out from behind her skirts. They were alive, scared, shaken, but alive. The relief nearly buckled his knees. "I'm fine," he managed. Then, looking at the burning ruins of the chicken coop, the bullet-scarred house, the bodies that would need dealing with come dawn. "I'm sorry. This is my fault, my past, visiting itself on you." Sarah crossed the yard to stand before him. Her face was smudged with soot, her dress torn, but her eyes were steady. "Those men chose to come here, chose violence. That's on them, not you. If I wasn't here, if you weren't here, Thomas and I would be dead." She said it matter-of-factly, no room for argument. "Crawford's gang would have killed us, or worse. You think I don't know that? You think I'm some naive fool who doesn't understand what kind of world we live in?" Jake had no answer for that. Sarah reached up, touched a cut on his cheek he hadn't even noticed. Her fingers came away bloody. "Come inside," she said. "Let me tend that. Thomas, run and fetch water for the fire. We need to save what we can." They worked through the rest of the night dousing flames, securing the property, tending wounds. Jake dragged the bodies away from the house, lined them up for the sheriff to see. 5 men who'd come to kill and found death instead. As dawn broke, painting the sky in shades of pink and gold, they sat on the porch steps, exhausted, but alive. Thomas had finally fallen asleep, head pillowed on Sarah's lap. She stroked his hair absently, looking out at their damaged but still standing home. "It'll happen again," Jake said quietly. "Maybe not tomorrow, maybe not next month, but eventually. This is the life I bring with me." Sarah was silent for a long moment. Then, "My husband was a good man, peaceful, never raised his hand in anger, never carried a gun he was willing to use, and he died anyway, torn apart by men who saw his goodness as weakness." She looked at Jake directly. "I'd rather stand beside a dangerous man who'll fight for us than bury another good man who couldn't." The words hit Jake like a physical blow. He'd spent so many years seeing his capacity for violence as a curse, a mark of damnation. But here was this woman, showing him it could be something else, a shield, a tool for protection rather than just destruction. "I don't know how to be anything else," he admitted. "Don't know if I can learn." "Then be what you are." Sarah said simply, "Just point it in the right direction. Protect instead of destroy. Build instead of tear down. It's not the gun that makes the man, Jake. It's what he chooses to do with it." Thomas stirred, mumbling in his sleep. Without thinking, Jake reached over and adjusted the boy's position, making him more comfortable. The gesture was small, natural, and it wasn't until he caught Sarah's soft smile that he realized what he'd done. Somewhere in these violent days and fear-filled nights, he'd started caring for this child as if he were his own. "What happens now?" he asked. Sarah looked at their scorched yard. The damaged fence, the work that would need doing. Then she squared her shoulders in that way he'd come to love. No, to deeply respect. Now we rebuild, stronger this time. We put word out that this place is protected, that Jake Morgan stands with us. Some will test that, as they did tonight, but word will spread. She smiled, fierce and beautiful in the dawn light. And we'll be ready. Jake nodded slowly. It wasn't the life he'd imagined, but then he'd never imagined any life beyond the next gunfight. This was different. This was worth fighting for, worth building, worth staying. All right, he said. We rebuild. Sarah's hand found his, squeezed gently. Together. Together. The word held promises Jake wasn't sure he could keep, hopes he wasn't sure he deserved. But as the sun rose higher, burning away the shadows of the night's violence, he found himself believing it might be possible, that a man who'd lived by the gun might find redemption in using it to protect rather than destroy. Thomas woke, blinking in the morning light. Did we win? Jake and Sarah exchanged glances. The house stood. They were alive. The threat was ended. For now. Yeah, boy, Jake said softly. We won. But the real victory, he thought as Sarah began planning repairs, and Thomas chattered about helping rebuild the chicken coop, wasn't in the gunfight. It was in this, the three of them together, facing the dawn of a new day, no longer alone in the harsh beauty of the desert. It was in choosing to stay, to fight, to build something worth defending. The war might not be over. Men like him always had enemies, always had ghosts. But for the first time in his life, Jake Morgan had something more powerful than fear or reputation or even his quick gun. He had a reason to live beyond the next sunset. He had a family. The territorial judge arrived in Gila Bend on a Tuesday, his black carriage raising dust clouds that could be seen for miles. Jake watched from the sheriff's office window as Judge Samuel Thornton descended, his bearing as rigid as the law books he carried. This was the moment Jake had been dreading and hoping for in equal measure. Judge is here, Sheriff Wallace announced unnecessarily. He'd been nervous all morning, alternating between defending Jake's actions and fretting about his own position. Got all the paperwork ready? Witness statements, evidence, the whole show. Jake nodded, his face carefully neutral. 3 weeks had passed since the night attack on Sarah's homestead. 3 weeks of repairs, of wary peace, of something that felt dangerously close to normal life. Now, the law had come to sort out the truth from the legend, and Jake wasn't sure which way the scales would tip. Mrs. Whitman's already here. Wallace continued. In the back room with the boy. Judge wants to interview everyone separately. Through the window, Jake could see townspeople gathering. News of the investigation had spread quickly. Some faces showed curiosity, others hostility. A few, precious few, showed support. Old Mrs. Chen from the laundry nodded at him, remembering how he'd stopped her grandson from being beaten by drunken cowboys. Sam the barber tipped his hat, recalling the time Jake had faced down 3 men hassling his daughter. Jake Morgan? Judge Thornton's voice cut through his thoughts. The man stood in the doorway, imposing despite his average height. His eyes were sharp, missing nothing. I'm Judge Samuel Thornton. I believe we have matters to discuss. The interview room was sparse, a table, 3 chairs, and the weight of Jake's past pressing down like a physical thing. Thornton spread his papers with methodical precision, then looked up with eyes that had seen too much to be easily fooled. 5 dead men at the Whitman homestead. The judge began. Before that, 2 Garrison brothers on the trail. Before that, he consulted his notes. A considerable trail of violence stretching back years. You've built quite a reputation, Mr. Morgan. Yes, sir, Jake said simply. No point in denying what was written in blood across half the territory. Yet, Mrs. Whitman claims you acted in defense of her and her son. Several townspeople have come forward with interesting testimonies about your character. Seems you're either a cold-blooded killer or a guardian angel, depending on who I ask. Jake remained silent. He'd learned long ago that talking too much in front of the law rarely helped. Thornton studied him for a long moment. "Tell me about Silver Creek, the incident that started your notoriety." So Jake told him, not the legend that had grown in the telling, but the plain truth. A young man hired to guard a stage, Tom Garrison and his gang planning to rob it, the moment when violence became inevitable. His voice remained steady, factual, as if describing something that had happened to someone else. "And after?" Thornton prompted. "After, I was a killer in everyone's eyes. Didn't matter that I'd saved the stage, saved lives. I'd shown I could kill without hesitation. That marked me." Jake met the judge's eyes. "Maybe they weren't wrong. Maybe that moment did change me into something else. But I never killed except when there was no other choice. Never drew first on a man who wasn't already reaching for iron." Thornton made notes, his expression giving nothing away. "And Mrs. Whitman, how did you come to be at her homestead?" Jake told that story too. The storm, the rescue, the garrisons on the trail, Crawford's gang, the night attack. He kept to facts, didn't try to paint himself as a hero. Heroes were for dime novels. He was just a man who'd been in the right place when someone needed help. "You could have ridden on," Thornton observed. "After the storm, after the first trouble. Why didn't you—" Jake was quiet for a moment, thinking of Sarah's stubborn courage, of Thomas's trusting eyes. "Maybe I was tired of riding. Or maybe you found something worth standing still for." Jake didn't answer, but Thornton nodded as if he had. The judge shuffled his papers, then leaned back in his chair. "I've been a territorial judge for 15 years. Mr. Morgan, I've sentenced men to hang, set others free, tried to find justice in a land that often seems to have forgotten what the word means. I've learned to read men like others read books. You want to know what I read in you?" Jake waited. "I see a man who's killed, yes, but also a man who's tired of killing. I see someone who stepped into violence young and has been trying to find his way out ever since. The question is, have you found it?" "I don't know," Jake admitted. "I thought maybe, but then violence found me again. Seems like it always will." "Perhaps. Or perhaps you've been looking at it wrong?" Thornton pulled out a different paper. "This came by telegraph this morning, from the Pinkerton agency." Jake's hand instinctively moved toward his gun, then stopped. Thornton noticed, a slight smile crossing his stern features. "Relax, Mr. Morgan. They're not here to arrest you. Quite the opposite. Seems they've been tracking the Crawford gang for months. Train robbery in Kansas, stage holdups across 3 territories, murder and worse. There's a substantial reward for their capture." He slid the paper across. "Dead or alive, as they say. Congratulations, you're $5,000 richer." Jake stared at the paper, not quite believing it. "I didn't know about any reward, which speaks well of your motives." Thornton gathered his papers. "I'll need to interview the others, examine the physical evidence. But I can tell you this, from what I've seen and heard. You acted in legal defense of life and property. The territory owes you thanks, not condemnation. The town might not see it that way. The town will see it how I tell them to see it." Thornton said sharply, "The law is what stands between civilization and chaos out here, Mr. Morgan. And today, the law says you're a free man who acted righteously." An hour later, Jake stood in the street, still processing what had happened. The judge's official statement had been read to the gathered crowd. Jake Morgan was cleared of all wrongdoing. More than that, he was commended for his protection of the Whitman family. Sheriff Wallace had been instructed to deputize Jake if needed, giving official sanction to his presence. The crowd's reaction was mixed. Some muttered and turned away, unwilling to let go of their prejudices. But others nodded approval, and a few even offered congratulations. It wasn't acceptance exactly, but it was a start. Sarah emerged from the sheriff's office with Thomas, both looking relieved. She'd been magnificent in her testimony. Wallace had said clear, precise, and fierce in Jake's defense. Thomas had apparently told the judge that Jake was the best man ever, even better than the heroes in Mama's stories. "It's over," Sarah said softly as they met in the street. "You're free. Of the law, maybe," Jake replied. Not sure about the rest. Sarah's smile was knowing. The rest will come with time. At least now you have time to find out. They rode back to the homestead together, Thomas chattering excitedly about the judge's fancy carriage and the crowd's reaction. But Jake noticed Sarah was quiet, thoughtful. "What is it?" he asked as Thomas rode ahead to check on his rabbit traps. "I was thinking about what the judge said, about you being tired of killing." She looked at him sideways. "Is that true?" "Every word." "Then maybe it's time to try living instead." That evening, as they sat on the newly repaired porch, Sarah produced a document that made Jake's breath catch. "I've been thinking," she said. "This place needs more than one person to run it properly. The railroad's coming, opportunities with it, but I need a partner, someone strong, someone who knows how to protect what's ours, someone I trust." She handed him the paper. "I had the lawyer in town draw this up. Equal partnership in the homestead. If you're willing." Jake stared at the document. His name was there beside hers, official and permanent. "Sarah, I can't—" "Yes, you can." Her voice was firm. "You've bled for this place. You've stood between us and harm. You've taught Thomas, helped me, become part of our lives. This just makes legal what's already true. People will talk. Your reputation, my reputation was ruined the day I refused to play the helpless widow. Let them talk." She moved closer, her presence warm beside him. "I know what I want. Jake, the question is, do you—" Jake looked out at the land, their land. If he signed— The sun was setting, painting the desert in familiar shades of gold and crimson. But it looked different now, not like an ending, but a beginning. "I've never had anything that was mine," he said quietly. "Never had anyone who was mine. I don't know how to do this. Neither did I when Daniel died, but I learned. We'll learn together." Thomas appeared in the doorway, holding his carved horse. "Are you staying forever now, Mr. Jake?" Jake looked at the boy, at Sarah, at the paper that would tie him to this place and these people. For years he'd been Jake Morgan, the gunfighter, the killer, the man to fear. But sitting here, with Sarah's hand touching his and Thomas's hopeful eyes watching, he realized that man could become something more. "Yeah, boy," he said finally, reaching for the pen. "I'm staying forever." He signed his name with a steady hand. Jake Morgan written in firm strokes beside Sarah Whitman. As the ink dried, he felt something shift inside him. Not redemption, he wasn't fool enough to believe in that, but possibility. The chance to build instead of destroy, to protect instead of threaten, to be a man Thomas could look up to and Sarah could rely on. "Welcome home, partner," Sarah said softly. Home. The word felt foreign on his tongue. But Jake thought maybe, with time and patience and these two stubborn souls beside him, he might learn what it meant. The gunfighter was still there, would always be there. That skill had saved them all. But now he was something more. A protector, a partner, maybe, someday, a father to the boy who already looked at him that way. The stars came out, bright and constant in the desert sky. Somewhere in the distance, a train whistle echoed. The future, coming fast. Jake Morgan, gunfighter turned homesteader, sat with his new family and waited to meet it. He'd found his place to stand. Now came the harder task, learning to build a life worth defending. Dawn came gently to the desert that morning, painting the sky in watercolors of rose and gold. Jake stood on the porch, coffee cup in hand, watching the light spread across the land, their land. 6 months had passed since he'd signed the partnership papers. 6 months of building and working and slowly learning what it meant to belong somewhere. The sound of footsteps made him turn. Sarah emerged from the house, her hair still loose from sleep, Thomas trailing behind her with his ever-present carved horse. She moved to stand beside Jake, her presence as natural as breathing now. "You're up early," she said softly. "Old habits." Jake sipped his coffee, savoring the quiet moment. "Besides, today's a big day." It was. The railroad representatives were coming to make their final offer for the water rights. The homestead sat on one of the few reliable water sources for miles worth its weight in gold to the expanding rail lines. They'd build their fortune on that water, ensure Thomas's future, make something lasting of this hard-won peace. "Mama, can I go check the rabbit traps?" Thomas asked, bouncing with 6-year-old energy. "After breakfast," Sarah said automatically. Then, softer, "And take Jake with you. I don't want you going alone." The boy's face lit up. In the months since Jake had stayed, Thomas had transformed from a shy, fatherless child into a confident young boy who shadowed Jake's every move. He'd learned to ride properly, to mend fences, to treat animals with firm kindness. More than that, he'd learned to stand tall, to look men in the eye, to be brave without being reckless. "Yes, sir, Mr. Jake," Thomas saluted, a gesture he'd picked up from watching the cavalry troops pass through town. Jake felt that familiar tightness in his chest, half pride, half fear. He'd never thought to be responsible for shaping a young life. The weight of it sometimes kept him awake at night, wondering if a man with his past had any right to guide an innocent soul. Sarah seemed to read his thoughts, as she often did these days. Her hand found his, fingers intertwining with easy intimacy. "You're good for him," she said quietly. "Good for both of us." "Am I?" The old doubts crept in, as they sometimes did in the quiet moments. "Sometimes I wonder if I'm just bringing danger to your door, if you'd be better off—" "Stop." Sarah turned to face him fully, her green eyes fierce. "We've had this conversation. I chose this. I chose you. Not the gunfighter, not the legend. The man who reads to Thomas at night, who works himself to exhaustion improving our land, who still stands guard even though the threats have passed." Her voice softened. "The man who holds me when the nightmares come, who makes me feel safe for the first time since Daniel died." Jake set down his coffee cup, freeing his hand to touch her cheek. These moments still surprised him, the tenderness possible between two people who'd seen too much hardness. "Sarah, I love you, Jake Morgan," she said simply. "All of you, the dark and the light, the past and the present, and I'll keep saying it until you believe you deserve it." Before he could respond, Thomas burst back onto the porch. "Riders coming, lots of them." Jake's hand moved instinctively to his gun, old reflexes never quite fading. But as the dust cloud resolved into individual figures, he relaxed. It was the railroad delegation. Right on time. Men in city suits looking uncomfortable on horseback, led by Sheriff Wallace and Judge Thornton himself. "Quite a welcoming committee," Sarah murmured. They met the delegation in the yard. Jake had learned to read men in suits the same way he read gunfighters, watching their eyes, their hands, the set of their shoulders. The lead negotiator, a Mr. Carlyle from back east, had the sharp look of a man who counted other people's money in his sleep. "Mrs. Whitman, Mr. Morgan." Carlyle began after the introductions. "Shall we discuss business?" They gathered around the kitchen table Sarah had polished to a shine. The offers began low, insultingly so. Jake let Sarah take the lead. She had a head for figures he'd never developed. But he watched Carlyle, saw the moment the man realized they wouldn't be pushed around. "The Santa Fe line is paying twice that for worse water 50 miles south," Sarah said calmly. "We both know what this source is worth." "Perhaps," Carlyle conceded. "But they don't have your complicated situation. A woman and a—" he glanced at Jake. "Reformed gunman. Some might say that makes your position weaker." Jake's expression never changed, but something in his stillness made Carlyle pull back slightly. "Some might say it makes us stronger," Jake said quietly. "We've held this land against all comers. We'll keep holding it. Question is whether the railroad wants to be our partner or our problem." Judge Thornton cleared his throat. "Gentlemen, let's keep this civil. The Whitman-Morgan homestead has clear title and valuable resources. The railroad needs water. Seems like there's a deal to be made that benefits everyone." The negotiation stretched through the morning. Thomas, bored with adult talk, had escaped to play outside. Jake could hear him through the window, making horse sounds as he played with his carved toy. The normalcy of it, a child playing while adults discussed business, struck Jake as almost miraculous after the violence that had brought them together. Finally, they reached an agreement. The railroad would pay handsomely for water rights, plus a percentage of ongoing usage. It would make them comfortable, not wealthy, but secure. More importantly, it would establish them as legitimate partners in the territory's growth. As the men prepared to leave, Carlyle pulled Jake aside. "I've heard stories about you, Morgan, the man you were. That man's still here when needed," Jake said evenly. "Difference is, now he's got better reasons to use those skills." Carlyle nodded slowly. "The railroad will need men like you, guards, troubleshooters, men who can handle problems before they become disasters. If you're interested." "I've got all the job I need right here," Jake said, glancing at Sarah. "But I appreciate the offer." After the delegation left, Sarah threw her arms around Jake's neck. "We did it! Do you realize what this means? Security for Thomas, money to improve the land, a future!" Jake held her close, marveling at how right she felt in his arms. "You did it. I just sat there looking menacing." "We did it," she insisted. "Together, like partners should." That evening, as the sun painted the desert in shades of amber and rust, they sat on the porch as had become their custom. Thomas was teaching his carved horse to jump over pebbles, lost in his imagination. The night was peaceful, filled with the ordinary sounds of their life: chickens settling to roost, horses nickering in the barn, the distant call of a hawk. "I've been thinking," Sarah said suddenly. "About something the judge said, about making things official." Jake's heart skipped. He'd been carrying his mother's ring in his pocket for weeks now, working up the courage to ask what seemed like an impossible question: that a woman like Sarah might want to legally bind herself to a man like him. "Sarah Whitman," he said, pulling out the simple gold band. "Would you—" "Yes," she interrupted, laughing and crying at once. "Yes, of course, yes." Thomas looked up from his game. "Are you getting married? Does that mean Mr. Jake will be my real papa?" Jake's throat closed. He'd been many things in his life: gunfighter, drifter, killer when necessary. But father? That was a title he'd never thought to claim. "If you'll have me," he managed. Thomas launched himself at Jake, small arms wrapping tight. "I already told everyone at school you were my papa anyway," over the boy's head. Jake met Sarah's eyes. In them, he saw his future, not the lonely death he'd always expected, but years of sunrise coffees and sunset conversations, children's laughter and hard work under the desert sun, a place to belong, people to protect not from obligation but from love. The preacher came 3 days later, performing the ceremony at dawn as Sarah had requested. New beginnings should start with the new day. She'd said the whole town turned out, even those who'd once crossed the street to avoid Jake. Seeing him standing there, cleaned up and nervous as any groom, seemed to shift something in their perception, as the preacher pronounced them man and wife, as Jake kissed his bride with Thomas cheering beside them. He thought about the long trail that had led him here, all the violence, all the running, all the nights he'd thought would be his last. Every hard choice and desperate moment had been pointing him toward this, toward Sarah's courage, Thomas's trust, and a future he was still learning to believe in. Outcast Cowboy lifted the widow's child, then claimed her trembling lips at dawn. Sarah whispered against his mouth, remembering her own words from months ago. "Though I think we can improve on the story now." "How's that?" Jake asked, holding her close as their friends and neighbors applauded. "Now it's redeemed man found his family, and together they claimed their dawn." Jake smiled, a real smile that reached his eyes and lightened years from his face. "I like that better." As the sun climbed higher, blessing their new beginning, Jake Morgan, husband, father, protector, and partner, stood with his family in the land they'd fought to keep. The gunfighter was still there, would always be there when needed, but now he was wrapped in something stronger than leather and iron. He was wrapped in love, in purpose, in the fierce determination to build something worth leaving behind. The railroad would come. The territory would grow. Challenges would arise, because that was the nature of life on the frontier. But they would face them together. Sarah with her steady strength, Thomas with his growing courage, and Jake with his hard-won wisdom that sometimes the greatest courage was in choosing to stay, to build, to love, despite the risk. The outcast had found his home. The widow had found her partner. The child had found his father. And in the harsh beauty of the Arizona desert, under an endless sky full of possibility, they began the rest of their lives together. Thank you so much for joining me on this Wild West journey of love, redemption, and second chances. I hope Jake and Sarah's story touched your heart as much as it touched mine while sharing it. Where are you listening to this story from? Please share in the comments below. I love connecting with listeners from around the world. Don't forget to subscribe to From Wild West channel for more tales of courage and romance from the American frontier. And share your thoughts about what you loved most about this story. Until we meet again on the dusty trails of the Old West. Partners.